Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on History Five podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Paula Fredriksen. And today's discussion is based on our book called Paul, the Pagan's Apostle. That the link to purchase Paul, the Pagan's Apostle will be in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment. And with that being said, thank you for joining me today, Paula Fredriksen.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for joining me. So my first question that I'd like to ask is, what kind of text would Paul have seen instead of a Bible, since it did not exist in Paul's day?
Right. We think of the Bible as a single book, but it's actually a library. And we have the codex form, but in Paul's day, individual books of Jewish scriptures would have been in their own scrolls. So Genesis would have been probably the first 5 books would have been in the same scroll, perhaps separately. Psalms would have been in its own scroll, for example. Isaiah would have been, well, we have an example of the Isaiah scroll from Qumran. So that's the sort of, a scroll would be presenting the interface between the text and Paul's eyes.
Do we know about Paul's origin, how he was raised, and how he viewed Judaism prior to his conversion?
Well, Paul gives us a teaspoonful of autobiographical information in Philippians chapter 3 when he says that he was born to Hebrew parents, meaning Jewish parents, that he was circumcised on the 8th day, that as to his orientation toward interpreting Jewish scriptures, he was a Pharisee. And he says, with no false modesty, in terms of his following of the law, he was blameless. So that implies a certain type of outbringing. And I have no reason to think that he was the first Pharisee in his family. So that would be my speculation.
When did Paul convert to become a follower of Jesus?
I don't like the word convert for Paul because there is no such thing as Christianity in his day, and convert implies that there was a different religion that he was moving to from Judaism to something else. The word Christian doesn't begin to appear until the early 2nd century. I think Paul is operating inside of a particularly energetic stream of Messianic Judaism in the late Second Temple period. So I think he converted probably within a few years of Jesus's crucifixion. He mentions that he returns to Damascus after his experience of the risen Christ in Galatians 1. So that implies that, unlike the stories we get in the Acts of the Apostles, that it was in Damascus that he would have encountered Christ-following Jews against whom he had a negative reaction, and then he changes his mind. So it's probably within 3 years of the execution. And but the letters we have from him are from a couple of decades after that.
What is Paul's mission?
Paul introduces himself as an apostle to ta ethne, a Greek word that we can translate in at least 3 different ways in English. It can mean the nations, which implies nations other than the nation of Israel. It can mean Gentiles, which is another way of saying the same thing, but that seems to just imply a different group. And then there's also pagans, which is, but Gentiles are pagans and pagans are Gentiles for the most part in Paul's period. So that's why the title of my book is, instead of the apostle to the Gentiles, it's specifically the pagan's apostle, because the people he's talking to, the people he's doing outreach to, are pagans whom he is trying to make into pagans, so that they make an exclusive commitment to the God of Israel. And the reason he's doing this is because he says he believes that the kingdom of God is at hand, and he is getting as many pagans as possible to renounce their lower gods and to make a commitment to his God so they can be included in the kingdom.
How did Paul view the flesh?
How did Paul view the flesh? That's a superlative question, and there have been libraries written on the question. It's Paul usually has a negative orientation toward flesh. It's as a philosophical position that flesh is always the proximate reason for ethical failure. It's the flesh is something that fights against the mind or fights against the soul and so on. And we see that type of polarization in Paul. At other points, flesh means just a blood relation, as when he says that from his people, katasarka, according to the flesh, is the Messiah in Romans 9:5. And there it just means that, again, this biological family connection. So it depends on context.
What did Paul mean by if someone was circumcised, they had to keep the whole law?
That sentence about being circumcised and keeping the whole law used to be interpreted to mean that as if there were a punch list of commandments and you have to busily tick off all of them while you're after you've been circumcised, and all Jews had to strive to. The rabbinic trope is 613 commandments, and you had to do all of them, and so on. Since the work of Matthew Thiessen, that's changed a lot. He takes that to mean that the whole law about circumcision is what Paul's saying. If you're circumcised, you have to keep the whole law about circumcision, by which Paul means including being circumcised on the eighth day, which makes it an impossibility for his Galatian adult pagan males to do. So that's another argument for Paul's armory of fights against having pagans be circumcised if they're going to be followers of Christ.
Why did Paul frequently address his hearers as Adelfoy, brothers?
Adelfoy. First of all, I have to say that, like English, the masculine plural can include females as well as males grammatically. But I think most of the time, because he talks about circumcision so much, he is talking about males. And the word means brothers. His construction for how to integrate ex-pagan pagans into what he calls the body of Christ, this translocal phenomenon of assemblies of non-Jews who are worshiping the God of Israel through Christ's Spirit, is that they received a spirit of adoption. And that means something in Roman law. If you're an adopted son, you have the same legal status as a biological son, which means that you can inherit. And again, this goes to the idea of once you're integrated into the family, and family relations between gods and humans is a normal Mediterranean way of thinking. Once you're integrated into the family, you're an heir you're a co-heir with other members, biological members of the family. So that's why he uses the brother language as much as he does. He's insisting that these people, through the Spirit of Christ, can also inherit the promises of God's kingdom.
What did Paul mean by faith?
Faith is a word that shows up all over the English translations of Paul's epistles. It's pistis in Greek and it's fides in Latin. And a more accurate translation would be not faith, but faithfulness or loyalty. And I think that's more what Paul meant when he said faith. You have to have confidence in the message of Christ and adhere to it. That's what he's talking about.
How did Paul view the execution of Jesus, and who did he blame for Jesus' death? Did he blame the Jews in 1 Thessalonians 2:13-16, or the rulers in 1 Corinthians 2:8, or both?
1 Corinthians 2:8 are could even be cosmic rulers, not necessarily Romans. I tend to think of them as the archontes and dunamis that he describes in 1 Corinthians 15 as these cosmic demonic forces. And he's, I think, attributing the crucifixion to those forces that are ranged against Paul and against Christ when Christ comes back. So there's a hostile relationship between cosmic forces and Christ. First Thessalonians 2 is a problem. There was an excellent article in the Harvard Theological Review in the 1970s by Berger Pearson that made a very strong argument that it's an interpolation. And there's a German New Testament scholar, Angela Stendhardinger, who's made the argument very coherently that it's actually comes from the period of Justin Martyr and it's copied into the letter. And one of the reasons of that argument is that the trope that's repeated about Jews killing all the prophets and displeasing all men, and the wrath of God has come upon them at last. That sounds like something that would have happened in the year 70 with the destruction of the temple. So with the best will in the world, I cannot see that sentence in Paul's letters as being actually written by Paul, and we have no manuscripts that go back to the first century. The earliest manuscripts we have go back to the late second century. And by that point, this trope of Jews killing the prophets and killing Christ, well, it's already in Matthew, who's written later than Paul. So for all those reasons, I'm skeptical of that passage in Thessalonians.
Can you tell us about Paul's polarizing rhetoric in Galatians? Is he trying to do away with Jewish law or only some of the law? And is he trying to suggest that there is more than one God?
Um, I Paul knows there are lots of different gods, and he's fighting them. Christ is going to fight them when Christ comes back. He says in 1 Corinthians 8, 5 and 6 that we all know there are many gods and many lords, but for us there's one God, the Father, he says. So he's in a world that's very congested with deities. The difference between his God and all these other gods is that his God is the biggest God and the truest God. And that's a situation that Christ is going to establish definitively when he comes back. I'm sorry, there was another component to your question.
Um, is he
Polar,
trying to do away with Jewish law or only some of the law? And is he trying to suggest there is more than one God?
he's not trying to do away with Jewish law. What he's doing in Galatians, and he says some intemperate things in Galatians, is he's arguing to his hearers that the other apostles who have come to them and said that if they want to be Christ followers, the men should be circumcised. And Paul is piling on arguments against that because he says that Gentiles are integrated not through circumcision, which is signed in the flesh, right? But through getting the pneuma, the spirit of Christ or the spirit of God. So it's only spirit and not flesh that can affect the adoption of a pagan, ex-pagan, into the family of God. And that's why he's arguing so strenuously that they shouldn't listen to his these rivals or he's looking at them as rivals anyway, who have come into Galatia. He also says, though, that the point of their receiving spirit is so that they can fulfill the law, by which he means Jewish law. So he's hardly universal. I mean, typically that's been read as Judaism as opposed to Christianity. But what Paul is saying is, no, it's only my type of Judaism that works because it's spiritual and not this fleshly stuff that these other apostles are trying to persuade you of.
Why did Paul call the Galatians fools, and what is meant by the allegory of Sarah and Hagar in Galatians? And did Paul think it meant it? it undermines the salvation offered by his opponents.
Does he think that Hagar's Sarah allegory undermines?
The salvation offered by his opponents.
Yeah, that's the argument throughout the letter. Once he warms up to it, he's he's calling the Galatians fools because obviously some of them are listening to what these circumcising apostles are advocating. And Paul says that anybody who listens to any form of the gospel other than the one that Paul, is championing is a fool. I mean, it's a hard sell, right? If you listen to anybody else, you're a fool. And the allegory with Sarah and Hagar is again this idea of the adoption of sons, being a legitimate son, and it's Sarah's son who's the heir of Abraham, not Hagar, Ishmael. It's again fitting into the idea that flesh can't fix it. Flesh can't fix Gentile nature, as he calls it. He says in Galatians 2, he says to Peter in Antioch in the letter to the Galatians, we are Jews by physis, by nature, and not Gentile sinners, meaning that Gentiles or pagans are sinners by nature. And that's why they can't do this cosmetic surgery of just being circumcised. They have to, this is again, Matt Thiessen, they have to have the deep gene therapy of an infusion of spirit in order to effect an adoption of sons. And what proves that they do have the spirit? They can work signs and wonders. They can discern between spirits. They have glossolalia, and they are able to fulfill the law.
What is the point of Paul saying that Jesus was born of a woman under the law?
I think it's emphasizing that he had truly had what he calls in Philippians 2 a slave body, a fleshly body. And there's only one way to get that right, is if you're born of a woman. So he's emphasizing that. And born under the law is emphasizing that Jesus was a Jew.
Did Paul blame the earthly death of Jesus on cosmic forces? Did he think that cosmic forces controlled earthly powers to kill Jesus?
Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4:4 that the God of this age is blinding the minds of unbelievers. He's actively engaged with fighting these gods, just as Christ will be when Christ comes back. So there's an implicit hostile relationship between these cosmic powers and the God of Israel, who is a bigger, better God, and who through his son, the Messiah, is going to conquer these other gods. So that's one of the other reasons why I read this as meaning the rulers of this age being the cosmic powers, also because of Romans 13, where he tells his audience to obey Roman rulers. So it would be odd if he had Roman rulers in mind for the execution of Jesus.
What did Paul mean by the seed of David in Romans?
Conjuring David next to the word Christos, Mashiach, Messiah, is a way of saying that Christ has the correct messianic pedigree. And that forms a kind of inclusio, a kind of start command and stop command for Romans. In Romans 1, verse 3, he says that Christ is the Davidic Messiah. He's descended from David according to the flesh, which is another way also of saying that he's Jewish. And at the end in Romans 15:12, he says that the root of Yishai, the root of Jesse, which Jesse was the father of David. So the root of Jesse will rise. He who rises to rule the nations, which is another idea about the Davidic Messiah being a conqueror. And he's going to rule all these ex-pagan pagans when he comes back.
Is there evidence of pre-Pauline traditions with Paul's letters, like the Philippians hymn in Romans 1, 3 to 4?
Um, if you pick up any commentary, that argument will probably be made. I'm not convinced that it's pre-Pauline. And the fact is, once Paul uses it, it's Pauline material. So that's one of the questions of New Testament scholarship I don't stay up late at night worrying about.
How did Paul view apostolic competitors?
Paul did not like competition, and he says some really pretty negative things about people he perceives as competition. He calls them so-called super apostles. He's being sarcastic. He calls them false brothers. He calls them deceitful workmen. And he says in 2 Corinthians 11, he likens them to Satan because even Satan can present himself as an angel of light. So competition, as we know from his tone in Galatians also, and in 2 Corinthians 11, competition doesn't bring out the best part of Paul.
How did Paul view the baptism of the pagans, and what did he think occurred after one was baptized?
I think he sees baptism as the ritual medium through which spirit is infused into the fleshly body of the ex-pagan. I also think Jews who are in this movement are baptized as well, and what that means is that there's a universal necessity for this infusion of spirit to prepare for the coming kingdom.
And lastly, when did Paul expect Jesus to return, and what did he think would happen once Jesus did return?
Luckily, Paul unambiguously states in almost all of his letters that the kingdom of God is about to occur and Christ is about to come back. He says in 1 Corinthians 7 that the form of this world is passing away. He also says in the same chapter, in view of the impending distress, don't have sex. That's a small window he's talking about of time. In 1 Thessalonians 4, when he describes Jesus coming back, descending from heaven with a cry of command and the archangel's call and the sound of the trumpet of God, he says, "We who are alive, who are left," which sounds like he's expecting to be alive. In 1 Corinthians 10, he tells his community that it's upon us that the ends of the ages have come. They've already arrived. And in Romans 11, he says, the hour, you know how late the hour is, the night is far gone, the day is at hand. All of that inclines me to think that Paul was expecting Christ to come back within his own lifetime. What does Christ do when he comes back? That's where you get a lot of the martial imagery that goes along with the idea of a Messiah. A Davidic Messiah is a pious person, but he's also an effective warrior. And who is Christ going to fight when he comes back? We get the list in 1 Corinthians 15. He's going to fight every archon and dunamis and exousia, every rule and authority and power, these cosmic energy shells that sit around Paul's geocentric universe. He's going to overcome hostile gods in Philippians 2. Once Christ comes back, knees above the earth and upon the earth and below the earth are going to kneel in front of the Messiah to the glory of God the Father. That's a lot of superhuman knees. So Christ is going to have this cosmic battle with the forces that Paul considers frustrating him in his mission, and will triumph, and then that will be the establishment of the kingdom.
And I'd like to remind everybody that the link to purchase Paul the Pagan's Apostle will be in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment. And with that being said, thank you very much for joining me today, Paula Fredriksen.
Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during the live stream. Thank you.